Thank you all for coming back. I hope you had a good break and a good lunch and all of that. So we have four speakers at the front of the table here, and I'm going to go in the order that it's in the program, though it might not be the most efficient order, but it seems to work pretty well. So we're going to start with Marisha Shaheen, who is one of our graduate students here at the University of Michigan in political science, and was actually in a class of mine, to her regret. But nevertheless, we're going to start with her. And she's going to speak about the early Young Turks and international law, carving an Ottoman cosmopolitan. Listen.
Thank you. Can everyone here? Okay. Okay. I never used one of these. Yeah. Oh, right. I know how to use a normal mic. I don't know about this. Okay. Hi, thank you for having me. So I'll talk about, I think, an earlier period than most people. I focus on mainly in the late 19th century and pre-1908 Young Turks. So my paper is mainly about the 1902 Congress of Ottoman Liberals in Paris and their failed plans towards a cosmopolitan multi-ethnic polity or some sort of democratization, and how that had much to do with global affairs. This is a chapter from my dissertation where I investigate, like, the general project as kind of sprouts of anti-colonialism in the late Ottoman Empire and late Ottoman political thought. And probably, as many of you know, the main two guys pre-1908 are Ahmed Rezade and his co-conspirators, who I think of as more so an anti-capitalist figure who is critical of European expansionism, but also its driving force that is profit. And then Prince Sabahaddin, who's more very famously Anglo-liberal and capitalist in like a very early 20th century kind of way. And there's a bunch written on both of them, and I'm hoping to bring a different perspective to their thought by thinking about it more so on a global scale. So what I find interesting about both of these thinkers is their awareness of both the problems within the Ottoman Empire, mainly the oppressive rule of Abdülhamid, but also the problems minority populations and specifically Armenians were facing at the time that they're doing this, but also cognizant of the weird situation the Ottoman Empire was in vis-a-vis its relations with the West. So as one of the few sovereign powers left in the world that is outside Europe in the late 19th century, one could say the Ottomans were in like a weird liminal situation of being nominally included in things like the Berlin Conference of 1884. Like they have a seat at the table, but in a lot of ways, they're at the whims of the great powers and what a lot of people call a semi-colonial relationship with the West. And as I think Keith said a few hours ago, they had settled colonial policies, but they were also under the threat of colonization a lot during this time. And dissidents were trying to resist both of these things that are interlocked, like the domestic tyranny of Abdülhamid and the international tyranny of European imperialism. And while I was trying to read through the records of this Congress, this pattern of trying to resist both became very apparent to me. Having to do that constantly meant, I think, falling short in both, or one at least. And another interesting aspect I find is like neither one of these guys, possibly no one in this Congress, really see nationalism as an answer to the empire's problems and are critical of both separatist groups, but also burgeoning Turkish nationalisms. As Ron said earlier, there were a fair amount of people and revolutionaries who wanted to be Ottoman and work as Ottomans as opposed to their particular ethnicity. And I'm trying to kind of think through that, what is, like, Ottomanism obviously failed as a revolutionary idea, but what could it look like and how can we think through the problems of nation states through such a framework, including some post-colonial nationalisms? So I chose the Congress specifically focusing on how international law was used in it. Because I think at this moment, especially for those who were not part of the state apparatus in the Ottoman Empire, but trying to reform it, it's when the extricability of the international and the domestic became very, very crystallized. And the need to resist despotism in both spheres became a very, it's a full-fledged concern. And I argue that the use of international law, especially appropriating strategically and selectively international treaties, specifically the Berlin Treaty of 1878, shows that the critique of Young Turks was oriented both internally and externally, and also kind of functioned as an anti-colonial, but also as an auto-critique. rather than being about justifying, critiquing, or obscuring hierarchy. They use international law as a means to contest domestic despotism and anticipate a different polity, as well as trying to reimagine the world order. And believed they could establish a new Ottoman polity with equal citizenship, possibly, while asserting the Ottoman Empire as an equal of other sovereign states at the apex of European imperialism. The interesting thing I think about the Congress is it did not start out as something that nobody thought they would talk about international relations for several days. Like they felt the need to convene and figure out a well thought out strategy to topple Abdulhamid's and then bring back constitutional rule. And they brought together 47 exiled dissidents from a variety of backgrounds, ethnicities, languages. The main language they spoke was French in the Congress. And the initial platform was an Ottomanist platform, which was returning to the constitutional order, reconvening the parliament. And international treaties were viewed as guarantors of these aims of equal citizenship and democratization. Specifically, I would say the Berlin Treaty, which wasn't super favorable to the Ottoman state itself. It had the superficial egalitarianism in Article 62, which the emperors found compelling. And I think that confirms how internationally oriented this Congress's members were during these discussions, considering that the aim of it was not that at all initially. And in that way, the meaning of sidelining of certain countries, or sometimes some sort of colonial subordination itself, became central to the debate about projects of domestic reform. It started out, this is a very long fight, so I'm not going to go into it, but like Sabah ad-Din poses an amendment to the platform that says we should ask for aid from Europe. And then this doesn't go over well with the Ahmed Reza camp. And there's like pages and pages written on this for like several decades. So, but I just want to say a few things on what that moment could mean. I think these two camps represented, competing ways of thinking and reading the interests of Europe and how to deal with that as kind of non-Western intellectuals. And I think they do say something about the predicament of the non-Western intellectual and some anti-colonial struggles at large, which is a unified front is rarely possible. And the struggle had to adapt to a constantly shifting and expanding and just constantly modifying itself force that is Europe. And in this particular case, I think Ahmed Reza correctly diagnosed the endless ambition and drive for profit that caused imperialism, which would eventually come after every corner of the earth. And that's why it had to be resisted. And Sabah ad-Din, I think, also accurately read the power imbalance, but for some reason he thought cooperating with Europe is a smart thing to do and resisting would be in vain. And the idea of Europe itself, anyway, is a very loaded idea, consists of different ways of intervening, colonizing, and that made things even harder for, I think, people from outside Europe to read what's going on and see a complete picture. So their reliance on international law, I think, says a thing about world under imperialism generally. Notwithstanding what we retrospectively know of the then kind of intractable character of international structures of domination, these actors had to read the colonizer, for lack of a better term, through the medium of international law, because that is the one thing they shared. And in particular conjunctures, their own projects and sense of the world led them to mobilize and bend these systems and their legal instruments. And the egalitarian packaging of international law from the onset provided some legitimations for the inequalities created by colonization, and the violence produced in its name. But this framework, as many have used later on, also created an opportunity for anti-colonial movements fighting for global equality and solidarity to assert themselves in creative ways. And a lot of radical projects have come out of that. I think in the specific case of the Young Turks, it's also they're in a kind of, the Ottoman Empire, I guess, is an exceptional situation because they're a sovereign state. So technically international law has to apply to them, which a lot of colonized peoples did not have at their disposal. And they just try to keep that spot, avoid becoming outsiders in that framework. So international law, I would say, carved the space for anti-colonial contestations of the world order, became an avenue for consolidation of factions competing diagnoses of the intentions of the oppressors. And this presents, I think, the dilemmas in interpreting how to work with external domination that the Congress faced. at many moments. Am I doing well on time? I have very little left, sorry. They felt that they would not be able to cater to both the domestic and international, and I think that turned out to be endemic to the real politics of anti-colonial struggles. And the relationship between the domestic despotism they faced within the Ottoman Empire and the despotism the Ottoman Empire itself faced on the diplomatic stage, while at times in tension, also often reinforced one another. And resisting one could mean bolstering the other, and the constant concern about this relationship had the potential of either diminishing resistance or seriously compromising one or both. So their project at the end was trying to keep the multi-ethnic character of the empire intact and build a constitutional order within it, which seemed more possible in 1902, where nation states were not the norm of like how to belong in a polity. And that departs from later on, the later anti-colonial nationalisms of the 20th century, second half of the 20th century especially, which were successful and thus set the norm. But I think including that earlier period helps us see projects kind of complicates the picture. So thank you.
Okay, now we're going to switch from international relations to germs. And Sam Bill becomes very highly recommended by my daughter Anush, who put me on to a paper he gave at Northwestern, I think it was, conference. And he is at Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, the university that's conveniently named after me, and about germs of nationalism and intercommunal microbes at the end of Ottoman Empire. Sam.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. I wish I taught at the university system named after Ron, but I actually teach at Vanderbilt University. Our dear colleague Shahika is at Binghamton.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Vanderbilt, named after some billionaire. I'll get
you didn't have to say that part. But thank you everyone for being here. It's really been a pleasure to look at all of the work that people are engaged in and see how exciting it is. I wanted to talk briefly about this book that I just wrote, and this is slightly about self-promotion, but also about other things. So this book, Locus of Power, it's about the Jazeera region before, during, and after the genocide. And it takes as its kind of central focus locusts and how they make this environment and the mobile political economy of this space, and traces how the empire to nation story in the Jazeera tracks onto the eradication of this kind of insect, and with it a number of kinds of human life. And a part of that is focusing on comparisons between people and insects. And so every chapter is focused on a particular comparison between Arab nomads, Kurdish nomads, Armenian deportees, Assyrian refugees. All of these people are compared to locusts at various points. Sometimes by very prominent people. Zia Gökalp compares Arab nomads to locusts. Yashar Kamal says orphans after World War I, they devastate villages like locusts. So this is just this recurrent analogy and metaphor that's made. And so I wanted to mention this because there are some overlaps between that concern with metaphor and also material entanglement, and what I'm going to talk about briefly today. But also because I don't think I could have written this book or done this research without WATS. Like I don't think without the intellectual space opened up by the question of genocide, that this would be possible to think about the genocide as part of history rather than a thing that needs to be proved. And so I wanted to express gratitude. I know a number of people have said this, but I want to reiterate it to Muge Hoja, to Ron Hoja. Thank you for your scholarship. And also just thank you for your labor of building institutions and building community. I I couldn't have done this without that.
Thank you, Sam. I think we should have monitorized that and
We can talk about
it's all
that
free.
later. We can talk about that. I want to move on to germs now. The idea of the paper is to think about the fact that so many of these episodes of violence at the end of the Ottoman Empire are occurring at the exact same time as there are these radical revisions of how people think about disease and how people think about different relationships between bodies and environments. And maybe the most simplified version of this is to say that disease went from being a thing that was located in place, right? Miasma, if we think about it in that sense, bad air. A disease like malaria has this concept of disease etymologically encoded in it. Malaria, bad air, right? So in the 1880s and the 1890s, thanks to discoveries of people like Pasteur, Koch, often in colonial settings, there are these new understandings of disease coming from viruses, germs, microbes, malaria not coming from bad air, but coming from mosquitoes that spread malaria. And of course, we also know that a lot of important organizing of nationalists and reformers in the Ottoman Empire occurs through medical institutions. Thinking not only of the kind of genesis story of Taraki, but also just the way that people, as they went out to, for example, treat cholera epidemics in Anatolia, they were also organizing on the side, right? So Zia Goko, who I mentioned before, he's brought into the fold thanks to coming in contact with doctors who are politically organized. And there are a number of cases of this that we can see. Alongside this, in almost every account that we have of some kind of ethnic violence at the end of empire, there is this recurrent metaphor of comparing people to germs. Right? We can think of Dr. Reshid saying, you know, the Armenians are microbes in the body. There are examples of this almost everywhere. And there are actually quite poignant expressions of this. This is from 1908 in the wake of the Constitutional Revolution, or maybe if we want to call it constitutional coup, as Ron suggested earlier. The term here is millet microblare. So the microbes of the nation, and it depicts the coterie of officials around Abdulhamid II. You can see Arab Izzet up on the left, chewing on the flag, and a number of other figures. Salim Madhame is here somewhere, Shafiq. So there's a way that these real changes in how people think about disease and how people think about relationship between bodies and place, they're beginning to shape the idiom through which people describe politics. They're beginning to shape the idiom through which people understand nation. I'm also very suspicious of what I'm saying. I'm saying this, and also the historical materialist in me is unsure of how far to push this argument, whether this is just a correlation or whether there is some sort of causative aspect here. But we can talk more about that later. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, everyone.
Exemplary. Thank you. Now, our distinguished guest and presenter from SUNY Binghamton, Sarika Karatepe. Actually, is it correct that you do American history, or that can't be right? No?
No, I'm not.
No.
I'm TAing for American history.
Say it again?
I'm TAing for American history class right
I
now, but
see.
I'm not doing American.
And your own field is?
Middle East.
Middle East. Okay. Yeah. Because I tried, you go online to find out about these things, and there's all kinds of confusion, right? About these things. And then you find out, who a person is dating and things like that, which is totally irrelevant to what you're about to hear.
I'm gonna Google my name.
So SUNY Binghamton, Sarika is going to speak on gendered labor history of the Armenian genocide, slave labor, social reproduction, and sexual violence in the late Ottoman Empire. Saidi.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I'm really honored, happy, and then excited to be here. Today I want to share my earlier findings on my research on the gendered labor history of genocide, which will hopefully be my final chapter of my dissertation. So paper I submitted for this workshop explores the enslavement of Armenian women and children during genocide. And as you all know, enslavement is considered an element of the crime of the genocide. And then this subject has very little scholar attention in Ottoman labor historiography. My dissertation, I want to briefly talk about the dissertation. It's an entangled history of capitalism, gender, family, sexuality, and labor in the Ottoman Empire. And I consider woman itself as a category of labor and look at the different forms of labor that women and children provided, namely free and unfree labor. Also, I'm analyzing social reproductive work. And by doing this, I want to show how imperial, global, and regional capital holders employed a set of tools to appropriate housework, control the reproduction of family, and subordinate labor power into circuit of capital during a moment of ascending global and local markets in the empire. And in my dissertation, I argue that Ottoman institutions, capitalism, mass atrocities, existing social hierarchies, patriarchy, and then gender roles shaped the Ottoman labor force throughout the 19th century. And also I bring the variety of Ottoman phases of violence-driven accumulation and exploitation to the center of my dissertation. So before talking about the enslavement, I want to open a parenthesis and will briefly talk about what I mean by socially reproductive work. So as you all know, women are relegated to performance of reproductive work, and this category is largely expelled from the wage relation throughout history. So the liberal understanding of capitalism, which analyzes the sole basis of accumulation in the individual wage earner as a free worker, erases the contribution of both family and enslaved, forced, imprisoned units of labor power. And as a critique to wage fetishism in vulgar Marxism, I argue that capitalism should not be defined the presence or absence of wage labor. Instead, it's a mode of production based on the extraction of labor surplus through a variety of forms of exploitation, of which wage labor is constitute only just one possibility. And then this way of thinking capitalism, I think, allows us to stress the unpaid domestic work as well as a broader capitalist history of wageless worker in the world where petty commodity production, forms of slavery, indenture, unpaid labor are the norm, actually. So I hope this approach will enable us to bring the category of social reproductive work as a category of labor in our field. So throughout the long 19th century, the output of the traditional male-dominated guild-type labor organization fell in the empire, and then Ottoman women, including Armenian women, as unskilled, low-wage workers, stepped into, as you all know, played key roles in textile manufacturing, clothing, and tobacco industry. These women, with the words of Don Quadrat, provided incredibly cheap labor for small-scale commodities and rural production in the empire, and then basically became a determinant for capital accumulation in the 19th century. And state-led systematic mass violence towards Armenian society, as you know, started in Anatolian cities in the late 1890s, and then accelerated during World War I and shaped, I argue, the entire Armenian labor force and feminist structure. And as a result of the mass atrocities in the 1890s, Armenian women and children became more vulnerable in newly emerging carpet-weaving Anatolian cities. And then during World War I, the Ottoman state led and encouraged the confiscation of properties and turned this Armenian vulnerable woman force and children into an incredibly cheap labor force, compared to other minorities and Muslim subjects of the empire. so many of the displaced were sent to the deserts of Syria, where they were subjected by plunders, starvation, kidnapping, and enslavement. And it was in this context these women and children were put up for auction, enslaved, and or like sold in family-friend networks. With the words of Zabaldiyesan, I could say that like public auctions provided the open sale of women and children's bodies. And according to Paul Adalyan, I quote, "The public auction of Armenian girls revived a form of human bondage that was for the most part erased elsewhere in the world. The auctioneer made money, the purchaser had a slave servant, and the harem woman added to his household. This kind of brutalization scared countless Armenian women, many incapable of bearing the shame of giving birth out of wedlock to children conceived from rape and abused by their Kurdish and Turkish owners, choose to forego Armenian society after the war and remain with their Muslim families. Some were rescued and a few escaped, some taking their children with them, while others fearing reprisal abandoned them. Some Armenian women taken into harem against their will were often tattooed on their arms, chest, or face as signs of being their own, as a way to discourage escape." So these women worked in the farms. Some of them were like forced to work as a sex worker. Some of them were forced to like sell fruits, vegetables, and yogurts in the markets or like bazaars in the empire. Besides working as a like seasonal worker or like sex workers, Armenian women, I argue, like were forced to do domestic work in Ottoman households, such as cooking, sewing, washing, cleaning house, raising children, investing emotional care, and caregiving for the elderly members of the families. So like Marxist feminist critique of like, let's say, orthodox Marxist analysis on like labor critique has a critique on that, and then described this social reproductive work, actually, without which the reproduction of healthy labor force for another healthy working day is not possible for free. So that's why I think like labor historians should work on this specific type of work. And then I want to give you like an example from the Oral History Archive of University of Southern California Show Archive that I've collected in the like Nasser Library in Massachusetts. So Alhani Asalyan, who was born in 1909 in Samsun, got adopted by a Kurdisha in 1915. And then she was supposed to be an adopted grandchild. However, later she got married like to that Kurdisha and then became a housemaid of a big Kurdish family. And then she took care of like 17 people in the family. And she would, like, I quote her, she said, "I cleaned their filth, I cleaned the lice like this." And she also took care of their body and health when they needed. She provided care work for long hours in a day. And I quote her, she said, "I would work night and day like a donkey." So the other like important point that I want to highlight here, if I have
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. And these women also like endured the distress and pain associated with like sexual abuse or as a result of like sexual abuse, and faced like humiliating and violent sexual attacks as an essential feature of the enslavement in the Ottoman household. Like another example, Hırsırme from Sivas, who worked for long years as domestic slaves in Arab households. She suffered like certain mental health problems due to the abusive treatment of her master and then her master's friends. And then we learned from like the testimonies that she gave to like Karen Yappe Colony, was known as like a Armenian mother, like a Danish missionary. She took later like a long treatment in a mental hospital in Beirut. So my point is like about like sexual violence. Women were basically like trapped in the web of sexual violence that occurred either their survival or death. And as genocide scholars have argued that sexual violence was a significant part of state efforts to dehumanize Armenians. And genocide relied as much as on routine sexual abuse as it relies on mass killings and torture. And what I'm trying to do, similar to Silvia Federici's and Maria Mia's analysis on witch huntings and the devaluation of women in European society during 16th and 17th century, I argue that like enslavement complemented by systematic rape of Armenian women became like an essential ingredient strategy of violence, which guaranteed the overexploitation of Armenian women's and children's bodies and the devaluation of the woman's position and labor force in the late Ottoman Empire. I think I can stop here. Thank you.
Hey, our last speaker today, taking the microphone there, is Mehmet Polatel of the Haradin Foundation currently. And Mehmet was a fellow here at Michigan some years ago, where he learned all that he knows, of course. He actually already had been at Boğaziçi University, where I think we first met. I'm not sure it was the first time, but I was on his dissertation committee, which was a brilliant dissertation. And he, along with other colleagues, whose name I'm going to forget, who were...
That's good.
Yeah,
Not Uğur, sorry.
yeah, I can't ever remember if it's Uğur Ünger or
Uğur.
but he's a great guy, by the way, all three of them. And but he's going to talk about a serious topic, so let's not get silly here. Restoration under occupation, property disputes in the post-war Ottoman Empire.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm also very happy to be here. And I really learn a lot you being here, working with you as well. And I will talk about the property return issue after the war. In dissertation, I actually changed my time period, focusing on the pre-war period, but I always look at and to revisit the documents that I found before about this commission called Mixed Commission for Property Claims, which was established following the meeting between British High Commissioner and Grand Vizier Ferit Pasha. So this commission was established in March 1919 to deal with cases regarding the return of properties. So I look at the issue of property returns after the war, and since there was a massive property confiscation and seizure, there emerged enormous property problem at this point. And during the genocide, as Ümit and me and Uğur also showed, that CUP had made sure that to get Muslim people, ordinary or notables, directly involved in this matter. There were thousands of refugees who had been settled on these properties and thousands of local Muslims who had seized homes, fields, shops, etc. So there were thousands of Armenians who wanted to return to their homelands and to have their properties back. And it was evident that this process would cause tension and lead to widespread dissatisfaction. So this property issue was a potentially explosive situation, and by assigning these properties to thousands of individuals, I think the CUP had ensured that returns will be met with social resistance. So this paper is mainly about that explosion and how it affected return efforts. Because as I said, I focus on the cases reviewed by this mixed commission. I will not summarize all of them, but briefly elaborate on the main point of my paper. First, I want to give a little bit different account of the Ottoman bureaucracy in the armistice era. Because in the official historiography, especially in the Kemalist historiography, Istanbul government was always seen as a puppet of the occupying forces. They just gave the key of Istanbul to the occupying forces or the British forces. I think with this paper, I indicate that there was a much more complicated picture, because from the start, beginning with the signing of armistice, The Ottoman government had a reserve approach to this matter. They wanted to carry out the return process gradually and to try to limit the returns in various ways. And with time, some nationalist currents within the Ottoman bureaucracy became more and more dominant. In line with this development, the state began to make things very difficult for the operation of the Mixed Commission, especially the Office of Legal Counsel in the Supreme Court started to challenge the legitimacy of the commission and rendered it dysfunctional. So it's very interesting because it challenged the dominant image of the Ottoman state in these years. Another point concerns the Treaty of Sevres. This treaty is generally seen as a death blow to Ottoman sovereignty. When we look at the negotiations around the property issue and mixed commission, I think this was not the case. In this regard, the Ottoman state used this treaty to block the efforts to return the properties and to resist the occupying powers. So this case shows that such documents can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So I will also note that actually this was precisely why this Office of Legal Counsel was established in the 1880s, because its job was to search international law and treaties and find means to push for Ottoman sovereignty. And these documents show that they continue this to continue to operate in the same way under the occupation. And second, I want to come to the issue of social resistance to return. Okay. There was widespread resistance to the decision of the Mixed Commission. Refugees, local and officials alike did not want to return the properties, and they took the decisions of the commission to court. But what was more common was problems stemming from the enforcement powers, because British forces just they don't have enough power to enforce this decision all across Asia Minor. They rely on the Ottoman officials, and they are mostly in the local resistance. They are members of the local resistance, or they are kind of former CUP. And especially in rural areas, it was practically impossible for Armenians to return to their homes and to live in their homes because there were constant attacks. And specifically in places by heavy refugee settlement, there were more problems. Refugees who were settled in this houses had everything to lose, so they did not care about official decisions or laws. And of course, even in places like Istanbul and in the environs of Istanbul, the commission could not have its decisions implemented as well, because as especially shown in the cases of the farm seized by Nagihan and wife of Enver Pasha, some commission decisions for the return of properties were not put into force by the authorities. Thus, this enforcement problem were not just limited to the rural areas, but also Istanbul, where occupying forces had their forces there. And third point is related to the Ankara government and how its rise changed things. And as I said, there was already resistance from the ranks of the Ottoman bureaucracy. This was there from the start. As the nationalist movement in Ankara gained traction, such acts of resistance to the prospect of property return became more common. They became the norm, and when it became somehow clear that Ankara would be victorious in the war, the Ottoman bureaucrats in Istanbul simply started to act as if the occupation was over. That Ankara's success also affected Istanbul's policies. And last point, I want to note that the rise of the nationalist movement also affected the situation on the ground, or the social reaction to returns. As pointed out by British diplomats across the country, the emergence and rise of the nationalist movement stirred up tensions on the ground. The Muslim population that was settled on or seized Armenian properties became more resistant to attempts for their return. It seems that they were kind of emboldened by the recent developments. Plus, the rise of Ankara changed also the determination of the British in this because they started to think that it would not be wise to push for the property returns in Anatolia when nationalist movement was trying to mobilize the masses. From their perspective, the mass return policy, especially concerning the properties in central regions or Black Sea, could backfire and result in strengthening the nationalist movement. I have time? Okay. Yeah, in conclusion, Uh, uh, the operation of the commission were affected the changes in the political context, and they had a difficult task because of the social resistance and resistance of the urban bureaucracy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, thank you. So just some brief remarks and we'll open it up for discussions.
Wait a minute.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I forgot now. So, this is an interesting panel, you know, so our theme is this whole conjuncture at a certain moment of revolution, war, genocide, and its afterlives. And this panel deals with extraordinarily interesting and important themes. We've got the impact of international considerations, you know, whether to work with foreign powers to change the domestic situation or to try to do it on your own because of your suspicions of what their interests might be. The larger environment, you might call it the revenge of nature. And more importantly, in Sam's paper, the power of natural metaphors. There's something powerful about nature that people respond. You can even merchandise it. But what about things like plagues, disease, locusts, and germs? And the sexual violence and the problems of primitive accumulation. You didn't talk so much about primitive accumulation, but I'll say something about that. It's very much in the paper. And then the central question of property, which you can't get away from, and what its effects might be. So for Melissa, I have these questions, and this is one that plagues me and perplexes me, but maybe it's impossible to answer because it would take a whole history to do it. But since you approached this question, and it's in the paper in your discussion of the 1902 conference, why was Ottomanism impossible? If we take a normal kind of orthodox view, it seems that it's natural, quote unquote, to move from empire to nation. And nationalist discourses, in fact, argue exactly that this is inevitable or likely or whatever. But is it necessary, even if you move from empire to nation, that the nation end up as an ethno-national nation built on exclusivities rather than something more multinational, right? So that's my big question. The other thing is, I wonder if you're not, this is one of the most difficult questions that I have found trying to answer in when I dealt with these questions in the genocide book, is what were the Young Turks actually conceiving of as the end result of their revolution? And I worked against the notion that they wanted to do what the Kemalists wanted to do, that this was something else. That it wasn't an ethno-national state. It was a more Muslim, more Turkic empire. So how did this figure in those early discussions? As you mentioned, this is still early in the discussion of this movement. And of course, they're faced with one key problem. What the hell do you do with these non-Muslims and especially those damn Armenians? They're always a problem, okay? Armenians serve for this area what Jews serve for anti-Semites almost everywhere else. Sam, a wonderful paper and really interesting, and how wonderful that this whole move has been made lately toward more environmental history. I'm thinking of Matt Gazarian's, I was on his defense paper on famines and so forth, and the whole relationship of humans and environment, in your case, humans and insects. But in the paper, it's largely about metaphors. Am I wrong? And what kinds of language are employed, why they might be employed. These are kind of questions I'm asking. And why are they so powerful? Why those metaphors, in fact? That would be my big question there. And Sahika, this was really interesting, and it was interesting for me from 2 points of view. One, your approach, you're trying to do a Marxist analysis. And of course, there is no singular Marxist analysis. You referred several times to vulgar Marxism. would that vulgar Marxism were true, that we simply lived as expressions of economic forces. Wouldn't it be easy to do social science? But Marx himself wasn't a vulgar Marxist. In fact, he once said, "I'm not a Marxist," when people told him what Marxism is. And that's a problem for Marxists, because you always have to explain, no, I don't defend the great purges, or the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 or whatever, right? So, but that's okay. They seem to know what Marxism is better than Marxists seem to know. So, this seems to me an extremely important question to ask. What do you actually mean by primitive accumulation? Because in your paper, it goes back and forth and around as if you're still searching, which is a good thing to do. This is a workshop, and these are works in progress, a lot of them. So you mentioned that in Capital Volume 1, he has a discussion of primitive accumulation, and it's based on the experience of England and the dispossession of peasants and from the commons, the enclosure movement, and that capital or the value of property is handed from some to others, right? And that starts something called the capitalist or bourgeois mode of production, which is that now laborers have no means of production in their own, and so they become wage slaves. Oh, I'm sorry, free labor is what I meant to say, if there are any liberals in the room, right? So, free labor, and they're free to starve to death if they want, right? So that's what primitive accumulation meant originally. And by the way, people are questioning that, and the word primitive even, you're not allowed to say primitive anymore. So they're now calling it original accumulation, because you can translate the German word, which maybe Godfrey remembers because I forgot. Huh? Ursprünglich, yeah.
It's original, it's not primitive.
That's what?
It is original, but it's not primitive, because primitive takes a different connotation.
Well, why do they say primitive so much?
Mistranslation.
Yeah.
The Anderson translates it and the Marx translates it back. It's like something like that.
It's interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
The words are important, right? So that's really interesting. But you give a different idea of primitive accumulation, which I wouldn't necessarily, having discussed this with a whole group at Stanford of young Marxists who are dealing with primitive accumulation, that's their topic. I wouldn't have included necessarily the part that you call about the use of women, right? Now, Nancy Fraser actually makes a distinction between accumulation, you probably know this, but and expropriation. And she uses that, but it doesn't matter. These are terms. What the power of the piece and what you demonstrate is, first of all, that you cannot talk about capitalism without talking about reproductive work. That is what women usually are forced to do. But that's unpaid labor, right? So I remember my wife was a member of Wages for Housework, which was one of the first ones that brought this up, and it seemed like a very important revelation. I thought once when I was writing my book and giving lectures about the genocide, I was being so smart because I said the Armenian genocide was a gendered genocide. I was very positive. Women ended up differently than men. Men were killed first. Women had a better chance to be forcibly assimilated, that is, turned into Muslims. And you show that it was much more. It was much farther worse. It was far worse than that, enslavement, etc. And I said this recently at a conference in UCLA, maybe last April, and someone said something which just seems so right. And she said, all genocides are gendered. All genocides are gendered. They're about reproduction. They're about preventing reproduction of a people. And that includes, of course, not only destruction of women or enslavement of women in your case, but also the elimination of children, either the way Keith was talking about it, Antora, or in fact, murder. And many children were lost. So I thought that was really interesting. And I'd love you to tell me if you might, how we might elaborate that concept. And then I have a tiny factual point because I don't know. and maybe some of the scholars in this room know better, was enslavement recognized by the Ottoman authorities at that time as legal or illegal? My impression was that slavery had been eliminated, at least officially, in the Ottoman Empire, though it still existed here and there, right, and was one of the last places to eliminate it. And either way you answer that question, and let's say it was illegal, then what does the enslavement of Armenian women during the genocide tell us about how that law worked, or what didn't work, or was neglected in certain kinds of cases? So I'd love to know about that. And finally, with Mehmet, I think in your paper and in other papers like Ari's later, there's a very clear distinction, a kind of periodization that's appearing. And that is, there's something going on in the imperial period that's different from the period of occupation, 18 to say 22, and then what you might call the national or the nationalist period. And the property issue changes in those. And I wonder if it wouldn't be interesting to use that as a kind of arc in your paper somehow, at least present it as here ruptures that take place. In the occupation period, a different group of people, namely those protected by the occupation, now are empowered in a way they're going to lose it as well as their property in the period after. And the other thing that impressed me, and it's not a question, but I is how central property issue is to so many of these things. It's a failure of the Young Turk government that they couldn't solve the issue, that they couldn't get the law and their own state to return lands to Armenians. That was a promise that was made and never fulfilled, and it led to dissatisfaction and disillusionment among Armenians. So I applaud this particular approach, which you have in many ways pioneered. Okay, I'm going to ask you, keep those in mind if they're at all useful, but I'm going to open it to the audience. I mean, I'll let every chair have their own prerogative how to organize things, and we'll pass this lovely microphone around. Who would like to open up the discussion or ask a question to any of our followers? Michael first, then Armin, and then Dr. Okay, I will keep a list.
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting panel and a really interesting day too. I had a quick question for Sam, and I was just curious, do you ever see the different disenfranchised or minority groups that you look at flipping the script on health discourse and comparing empire to, you know, locusts or diseases or something like that? And part of the reason why I ask is from a pre-modern perspective, it's not totally uncommon to see, say, comparing the expanding Mongol armies when they're not listening to locusts or something like that, as basically a way of saying this is a punishment from God. But in the modern era, it gets reversed, and you know, it's the powerless who become vermin. So I was just curious, you know, what does it mean if we see or don't see an adoption of these kind of discourses on the ground?
Hey, Armin. I'm keeping a list. If you want to raise your hand, I'll try to see it.
Thank you to the panel for all the wonderful papers. I had one question for Mehmet. You know, despite all the disclaimers about using the Holocaust as a sort of comparative model, I was actually wondering if you might be familiar if any sort of restitution processes took place in the countries that came under Nazi occupation after the Second World War, and if any efforts were actually ever made in places like in France or Italy, etc., and if there was ever any sort of resistance that we see, like in the way that it appears in your paper. And Sam, I really enjoyed your paper too, and also, I mean, it's very interesting how you highlight these Ottoman doctors and intellectuals who are espousing this sort of rhetoric. But I think I've come across at least like several times in Armenian sources as well, where it's also employed in a completely different context. And the most memorable one that at least that springs to mind is Heike Mark in, I think, 1920 says that once the war has come to an end, there's these women who, I think in her article, in her journal is titled, fallen women who cannot neither figuratively nor physically be incorporated into the body politic because their blood has already been tainted. I think that's how she literally says it. I was just wondering, like, do you see that sort of rhetoric being employed by others in the Ottoman Empire, and if so, in maybe a separate context? But I'll just leave with those two questions.
Godfrey, and that'll be round one. So
Thank you. Thank you. This is fascinating, but I have to just in order to balance it out among the panel, I'm going to ask a question for Shahika. And that is about the concept of slavery. Because I'm assuming that Marx as a man of the 19th century is taking his sort of idea of slavery largely from the Romans. And I'm assuming that the American audiences of today, so mostly think of the American type of slavery as sort of their reference point, and both of those are very much sort of dichotomous. You can be free or you can be enslaved, and those are sort of two different legal statuses, and there is a clear way of how you get from one to the other. My suspicion is that in the Ottoman Empire, and in sort of this changes, of course, over the long history, there's a lot of sort of gradations of types of unfreedom and dependency that kind of elude this kind of dichotomous approach. And then I'm thinking about the way domestic labor is organized in the first place, sort of outside of context of genocide or so. Domestic servants oftentimes also sexual services are kind of expected, but there's also a way of at some point probably being almost sort of quasi-adopted or then married off. So there's various ways in and out, and there's not always money flowing, but the end result can often be the same. But I wonder, am I making this up? Or is there a way of thinking about the experience of this, the particular cases here, also in comparison to other forms of women's unfreedom? Let me put it in the broadest possible way, particularly in late Ottoman society. Or let me just sort of mention one case study. I remember reading Fethiye Çetin's account of her grandmother's life. There is a lot of sort of various examples along a kind of spectrum of this type of unfreedom going into that. But I wonder how that plays into your conceptualization. Thank you.
maybe just give it to the first speaker there, and then we can go right down.
You'll fight over it.
Okay.
We'll just go this way.
Okay, I think I have like 4 different questions. I would like start with like primitive accumulation. So actually like before me, like Sungur Savran, Ezgi Akyol, and I think İlker Yılmaz, if I'm not wrong, like they're using this term to describe like the plunder of wealth, confiscation of property in the during the genocide. And I think İlker is working on like confiscation of Jewish properties in like Edirne in early 1930s, I guess. So like I'm doing like a very much Marxist history of like Ottoman Empire. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to rereading like the historiography written on this topic with like Marxist term. And I think primitive accumulation allows me to like talked about like the violence provided by state, and then state also like encouraged this violence, and also led this like with the regulations, like Ümit worked on that, like Mehmet also worked on that. So like I'm referring the Onur Ulaş İnce's article on the legal aspect of the primitive accumulation, where he like makes reference to Walter Benjamin critique of violence, and then he uses the term capital positing violence and capital preserving violence. And then the regulations on like genocide, like environmental economy could be like a good example of that, for instance. So you have a question about like vulgar Marxism also, right?
I mean, you use the term,
Yeah,
and vulgar Marxism is basically economic determinism,
yeah,
right? And I always am afraid when people use Marxist categories that they may move down to this kind of economic determinism. And I think one has to be careful not to do that.
yeah, okay, I got it. I think yeah, that's true. That's why I think that's why I'm also like bringing feminist critique to Marxism. And I'm saying that like social reproductive work, like Marx really doesn't deal with this social reproduction and patriarchal dynamics in the household. And also you mentioned like Nancy Fraser expropriation. She actually like criticizing and then saying that like the primitive accumulation also like in let's say affects like the racial dynamics, and then the racial oppression during the like primitive accumulation, and it's also like very important. So I think Nancy Fraser perspective will be like a better, maybe using like expropriation might be better, might be a better term. So you ask also like a question about like the legal statute, no, sorry, the law, the evolution of slavery. So this is enslavement and slavery was illegal back then in 1950. I don't know, like I don't look at like the regulations in 1915, but I know from like Nazan Maksutyan's works that in 1918, like the Minister of Interior like sent telegrams to the provinces and saying that you cannot keep these women in your households. And like the rescue team in Aleppo, like in Syria also like so started looking for this woman. And then in 1918, actually, they acknowledged that this process is like illegal. Enslavement of Armenian women and children in their household is illegal. But before 1918, I've never like come across anything. I actually didn't look at it, and then I mostly like focus on like the oral testimonies while I'm doing research on that.
There's a section in the Mustafa Minawi's recently published
Oh yeah,
Communist Handbook about the evolution of slavery, its history, its trajectory,
yeah.
just for your information.
Yeah, and I think he's also like underlining that like even though slavery was abolished in the Ottoman Empire, that family, I don't remember their name, was able Azimzade was able to like buy like a slave from Sudan, as far as I remember, like in Istanbul, and he's saying that there was actually like a slave market in Istanbul, not like formal one, informal one, but there was a market in Istanbul.
I think also the trading, especially slave trading, kind of evolution, but there's a problem with Circassian immigrants.
Yeah.
Circassians came with their slaveries, and Ottoman want to remove slavery, but they resisted, so they allow them to keep.
Yeah, I think Ceyda Karamusa also is with this issue, and she's showing that is still like the case, and it's very pretty common buying like it's possible to buy like a Circassian woman in a slave market.
I would just add that there can be many different forms of what we're calling primitive accumulation.
Yeah.
The most primitive kind is what happened during the genocide. Kill everybody and steal everything, right? No, this is not the enclosure movement. Even this is pretty radical,
Pretty primitive.
and pretty primitive. You got primitive works there. And the second thing would be that it's foundational
Mhm.
to what follows the nature of the Turkish Republic and the creation, and others have mentioned this already, the formation of a national bourgeoisie, mostly Turkish, not or Muslim, right? Which is foundational, which is state dependent. It's not an independent bourgeoisie. It's not English entrepreneurs. It's state dependent always, which makes it complicit with the state, right? And that framing, it seems to me, is very important.
Just interesting, very first author who exactly touched upon that, it was Doğan Avcıoğlu. Doğan Avcıoğlu himself. In
Yeah, I should
60s.
go with you.
Wow.
Talking about national bourgeoisie.
Yeah. Oh, damn, I thought it was
He
my
framed it
idea.
exactly. He framed it
There
exactly.
are no new ideas.
He framed it exactly how you just.
Oh, yeah, but okay, I'll footnote him next time. All right, Sam, it's your turn. Which, by the way, just one more thing, sorry, I have it in here. Which is why the Turkish governments are so obsessed with the Armenian genocide. What are you so obsessed about? There are only 50 or 60,000 Armenians in Turkey. You could solve this and recognize or whatever. No, you can't. Because you're questioning the very nature of Turkish society, Turkish identity. This isn't Kurtuluş Savaşı. This is a genocide that starts it. This bourgeoisie and this modernization, it was based on a foundational crime. So they can't, they're locked into this, until they want to become truly democratic.
So the varlık vergisi is just an aftermath.
Well, it's part of it, isn't it? But it's
And
just
before
those.
that, if you think about it, the müsaade tradition itself, of course, is also what sort of opens it, because technically, in the Ottoman Empire, everything belongs to the Sultan, so to speak. I mean, there is no, anything afterward. And because of that, of course, and that's how they sort of control capital accumulation by the notables, or in the system, the askeri. They müsaade of them all the time, and that is pretty much what they think they're doing, just taking away the resources. And
These are oftentimes their slaves.
they're,
They're
yes,
slaves.
well, they're slaves technically, yes, symbolically, yes, you're right, yes.
One more point. My son-in-law is Kurdish. He was teaching in a Kurdish school in Van. When I first went to Van and met him there, they were teaching Kurdish school, right? Of course, all in Turkish, right? But Kurdish students in trailers, in little trailers, that there was no school. Next time I go, a gorgeous school, all beautiful, everything equipped. What happened? They appropriated that building from the Gulenists. So these confiscations are going on. They're like hilarious. They're part of the pattern, right? And now the Kurds, I don't think they understood that this was going to go to Kurds, but that's where it's still a very primitive kind of accumulation.
Very quickly, in response to your question, Ron, of why is it so powerful in this age? I mean, we also have the shift from the age of the microbe in the late 19th century to the age of eugenics in the early 20th century. And so all of these questions about property and who gets to own what, this is aligning with questions of racialization that, I mean, maybe we'll hear more about from Javad tomorrow. Michael, this question about to what extent is this similar to or different from early modern or pre-modern formulations?
Mostly they flip the script.
Right. So I'll get to flipping the script in a second, but there is a difference, I think, in the level of specificity of knowledge. And so I'll give you an example of this. I really thought about starting this paper with an Ottoman document that I found, or I came across, of talking about a rumor that Bulgarian bandits in 1902, there was a rumor swirling around the borderlands, right? And the Bulgarian bandits allegedly had a microbe of the plague. And they were allegedly going to put this microbe of the plague in the waterways of Istanbul and then spread plague to the whole city. And so what's interesting to me is the fact that this was understandable enough to peasants in this borderland area that it could be a rumor. And I think what's distinctive about that case is it's not a question of, locusts are a plague from God and they're going to destroy us just like the Mongols are. It's about human intervention, and it's about a human level of control based on a level of specific knowledge of a relationship with the environment. In terms of flipping the script, and this gets to Armin's question a little bit too. I mentioned this briefly in the article or the paper. In 1898, there's a description of Abdul Hamid as a human basilis. So he is the cholera. And so this is coming from unionists in Europe. And it's a very specific term, right? It's a very, very specific term referring to the specific form of cholera that you can see under a microscope. Another thing that I cite briefly in the paper is from the Ottoman veterinarian Osman Nuri, who is the only person I could find who was standing up for microbes. And he was saying, I think it's actually kind of strange that everyone's bad-mouthing these microbes, because actually we wouldn't have a lot of great things in this world. For example, yogurt. He specifically says yogurt. we would not have yogurt were it not for microbes. And this is also in
probiotic. Yeah.
Is probiotic. Yeah, exactly. And this is also in a publication that's aimed at like speaking to the public specifically. So he says this line about yogurt, and then he says öyle ya. That's how it is. Yeah. And so I mean, part of what I'm thinking about here is that there's a way that we can think about why is this discourse powerful at this time? But there's also a way that we can think about how people are actually learning about germs from these invocations of them in other contexts. And so it's not just kind of simple, oh, Koch or Pasteur discovered this and then it trickled down to society, but people are understanding these ideas about germs in relation to ethnic differentiation within the empire.
Also, if I may add there is the medicalization of the whole thing. For example, the doctor, what's the doctor who's after whom the Gülhane party is named now? He's the first doctor during this period to talk about hygiene, public hygiene. And he says he goes and regulates, inspects all the sort of grills and everything, and finds all these dirty ones, closes them. Besim Ömer. Besim Ömer, exactly. So I think there is also medicalization. This is when they start teaching about these things in military academies. And of course, the ones who translate the books from French to Ottoman are usually minorities as well.
Yeah, I mean, Riza Nur is at Lausanne, and he's saying the Donme or a parasite in our blood. I mean, it's really direct, right?
Riza is the worst, I agree.
What a bunch of characters we're studying here.
Thank you, Manik, for your question. I think I didn't particularly look at the cases of restitution after the Holocaust, but I know from others research that, especially the German occupied areas, of course, there were some agreement about restitution and reparation, especially the restitution of communal properties. But I think from Holocaust scholars research, they weren't actually implemented very well. There are still problems continued. I remember within like a few years ago, Poland, I think, rejected to pay reparation payment, saying that they were also the victims of Nazis. So that's why they are kind of using this frame to resist implementing the restitution agreement.
There's a literature on Poland and property and the violence that people, Jan Gross's book, Neighbors and things like that. Poland is particularly
interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think I'll address your questions. And one of them is really difficult and the other one's less difficult. So I'm gonna I'll start with the easy one. That was the second one. Which is as I understood it, what were the Young Turks thinking of at, about the, upcoming revolution and how do their fights earlier on kind of go into what happened later. I am like, this is actually, I think, a little. I do think that is one of the ruptures, because while we do call these guys the Young Turks, like a lot of, like, there's 47 delegates in this moment that I'm looking at, and a lot of them become very irrelevant after 1909. Especially like the two main guys, like Ahmet Reza and Prince Sabahattin are both, they go back after 1908. Ahmet Reza is the president of the parliament for a bit. But then they both get sidelined once the more military Turkish nationalist wing of the CUP take over. And Ahmet Reza becomes a high school principal and dies like before 1930, hence he doesn't have a last name. And then Prince Sabahattin dies in exile in Switzerland. So I think mainly, like, part of it is like they didn't have time to realize any of the platform that much, except for going back to the weak constitutional order and having a parliament, and then really nothing beyond that, I would say. And even that was not, it didn't take that long. I mean, it didn't last that long, sorry. I don't know, there are people who, there's, I think, very few, like, I don't think there are a lot of political theory written on this. But there's one that I read that calls this like, oh, it's a very Republican Congress, which I find kind of insane. There's like nothing about a republic in this Congress. It's very much like their platforms very much, oh, we're very loyal to the monarchy, not Abdul Hamid, but the monarchy's fine. Like, he's a kind of exception to that. So I think there's a lot of, like, they have very short-term goals that are solid, and then kind of lofty, imaginative things that they're trying to build that's going to take decades and didn't even crystallize at all, as like a more democratic, multi-ethnic polity where people belong based off of being Ottoman, which I guess ties to the first question you asked me, which was, I think, why was Ottomanism impossible? And I remember you asked me this like 3 years ago at the class, and I was like, oh my God, I've been thinking about it for 3 years and I don't know. I don't know, I've been trying to work through that a little. And I think my general question about, like, in the dissertation is just like, why is nationalism like that? And because there are anti-colonial nationalisms that aren't as exclusive as what happened in the Ottoman Empire. Like, a lot of Latin American countries are like multi-ethnic confederations. A lot of Africa is like that, like countries made up of a variety of, like, you would now call maybe nations or ethnicities. I agree that it didn't have to be ethno-nationalist, and it's kind of like I'm trying to, what I've found about like things written about Turkey is a little like, oh, the inevitability of like what's happened. And that's why I'm trying to work through like, okay, so what happened that this became inevitable? Because obviously there was like a not super long lasting, but several decades of like trying to make Ottomanism or something like that happen. And that wasn't, like, I think because I'm thinking it in like a more global post-colonial sense, there is like the entire like, oh, decolonization has to happen through nation states is also a big thing in post-colonial thinking. Later, but much later. But it is like, that is what ended up happening. And I'm trying to like contest that by saying like, no, there were other projects. They didn't materialize. I'm still working through why they didn't, but I think it's still like important to uncover the failed ones so that, I don't know, maybe it'll help us figure some stuff out. Yeah.
If you look at the discussion they have among themselves, especially after 1902, what becomes, I think, crucial is that there's a big debate within the CUP about should they have officers or not? I mean, you know, and how many officers should they have? Because some say, look, we've been around for so long and we're not able to get any change done. And others say, well, unless you have violence or military force, there will not be any change. But then they say, well, if we have the military, then how could we control what happens afterwards? But, you know, nevertheless, after that the debate, they do include them, and they are the ones who carry out the revolution or whatever you call it. And that's, I think, why the civilians lose power and the liberal agenda loses power as a consequence. once the military takes over, I mean, until Erdogan, I mean, the military wasn't a power in Turkey.
100 years of
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Is this on this particular point or?
One of them.
Okay, yeah, then, because I also want to say something about that, but let's stick with this point for a minute, and then we'll go on to other questions, yeah. This is a very important issue, I think.
So yeah, Marissa, I have a question. You brought it up in the last answer. Oh, I'm Arm Hugassian. That, and you say it in the intro to Getachu's book about post-World War II appeals to international law as like a post-colonial, like a tool of post-colonial national movements. So I wanted to ask, in what sense was the Young Turks' use of international law as a tool restricted or otherwise affected by the state of the world in 1902 versus the effectiveness of the use of this kind of thing post-World War II?
Post what, sorry?
Post-World War II.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think there's like two main differences.
No, but it's-
I can use my choir voice if that works.
Is that all for Sam, but it's off topic.
This is creating community.
I find that book very helpful, but in some ways kind of limiting. And I guess, I don't know, I'll tell why. I find her use of kind of the post-colonial predicament as unequal integration very, very helpful. And I think it explains a lot about the state of the world now. And I think that's her aim too. Because it's a bit like, I don't know, she looks at the United Nations and it's just who's ruling the United Nations, like stuff like that. But it is like nominally everybody has the same vote, but we can't do anything. You know, like we've been seeing it in the past couple of weeks where like everybody votes for a ceasefire and then America votes no, and it's just like not done. So that was kind of how I was trying to, the unequal integration thing really struck me when I first read it. And it does come from like African political thought, post-colonial thought. And I found that like it works with the Ottoman Empire in some ways, especially in this period, because it is like it is a sovereign nation. It is like in the situation in some ways that I think weaker countries are in right now. It's a sovereign nation, but it can't like do much internationally. It has like, there's a seat on the table, but it's like very symbolic, you know, like there's that, I think in Manawi's first book, there's that cartoon of the Berlin Conference and like kind of, yeah, like the Ottomans are just like in the corner and the big boys are talking on the table. And I thought like there is, I thought that's pretty important. And I think that is something that like both the state apparatus and also the dissidents kind of recognize, but still kind of try to, yeah, we're not on the same footing, but on paper we might be. So like we should try to use it as much as we can. How successful they weren't super successful in my opinion, like in the like the Young Turks weren't. Like I think it's just their utilization is more so thinking of this as, well, trying to assert that they're a sovereign nation to not so much success, but also I think it has like a second aim of contesting Abdülhamid through international law, because like a lot of so their platform mentions the two edicts from 1839 and 1856, which basically say the same thing of the Berlin, like Article 62 of the Berlin Treaty that they're really hung up on. But also I think they're aware that like, oh, Abdülhamid is not going to follow the Constitution anyway. Like it's suspended. So what is the one thing above we can do? It's go to the international. Like I don't know. Even now, it's like we were talking about the judicial coup that happened in Turkey today, which was kind of timely, I feel like. But so I think it had those two aspects, and like it. I do mention at the very end of the paper where that opened up a possibility for colonized peoples, and I think that's a little different because you know they declare their sovereignty through stuff like that, as opposed to like the Ottoman Empire was kind of, that was in the back pocket already. It turned out to be not super useful, and I think that like a lot of the world came to that conclusion later on. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think Jill, you have something on this point, and you have one.
Well, I just have new points.
Okay, and then we'll go to new points.
Yeah, so I'm also dealing with these questions of colonialism, international law, and in the late Ottoman Empire and what happens once the empire actually disintegrates. And I think from just adding to your reference to Minawi's work, the idea that the Ottomans were not a strong partner in the imperial game was a Western kind of image among themselves as part of an orientalizing and making perceiving non-West in a particular way that will indicate that the non-Western actors are not strong actors, whereas right after the unification of Germany and Italy and the Berlin Conference, we have two worlds: the colonizing and the colonizer. Right? There is a race of empires to colonize, and Ottoman Empire is definitely on the side of colonizing. They are trying their best to colonize within their limits. So they are losing some parts to Western colonies, but I think I tend to, looking from the perspective of the region that I work on, which is in Eastern Anatolia, placing Ottoman Empire somewhere between the colonizer and the colonized I have questions about that, because they have always considered themselves as part of the colonizing team and never colonized. And Turkey is actually, Anatolia is one of the very few places which has never been colonized in the world of the.
Except by Turkey.
Except, I mean, yeah. So
Internal.
So I was gonna actually just make the point that what is remained of the empire is what they could colonize, right? When we consider Armenia, Kurdistan, part of Arabia, it's a smaller empire, but it's and the Greeks on the western part. We could actually see it as the kind of the outcome of that colonial project to be part of the club of colonizers. So I wonder if you think putting, especially considering the continuity that is becoming stronger and stronger the more people study it, between Ottoman Empire and Turkey, which I am part of, arguing in favor of continuity. I mean that there was a strong continuity. So what I wonder how you treat this question of Ottoman Empire being semi-colony, rather not colony.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's.
I think how I think about it is more like I completely agree, and also like obviously can everyone hear okay?
Yeah. Okay.
I think point of Minawi's book is also that, like the first book is, yeah, they were trying to colonize as much as they can. I guess I'm trying to, I think that binary should be a little disruptive, especially in the cases of like Ottoman Empire is a good example of that. Of course, like it has its own very colonial policies, its expansionist, whatnot, but also I think the point I was trying to make more, maybe it wasn't super clear, and that's on me, was that there is also like it's not completely safe of being invaded by the West as like France is. And I think that is like a tension that exists in a few places at the time. And that's my main gripe with it, I think. I don't think it's like that clean a binary. And I do think like the Ottoman Empire, Japan disrupts that kind of, it's like, I don't know, I think a lot of people think of it as like a very clean division between like less than the rest, and it's just like whatever. And I think there are a few places that just like don't fully fit into that. And I think that means we should be rethinking that sort of like very strict division of these guys are the colonizers, these guys are the colonized, because I think there are places that are a bit of both. And that is like the tension that exists here that I'm trying to work through, if that's helpful.
Yeah, let's go.
So Marissa, this is really, I have questions and comments for, except for Mehmet, but, sorry, man, I'll talk to you later. Marissa, this is really solid work. But what I'm wondering is that there was a great deal of anti-colonial or decolonizing discourse at the League of Nations by 1919, 1920, which the Ottoman government, the Rump Ottoman Parliament, Umit, lean back, which the Ottoman Parliament did participate in, and then the government of Turkey. And it's a time when like a young Ho Chi Minh shows up at Versailles, and he's presenting petitions for Vietnamese independence, and a leader of the Mohawk Nation goes from Canada and does the same thing. So there is this emerging anti-colonial discourse that is frozen out at the League of Nations, right? But also the League of Nations was really committed to sort of this collective security idea, which is an international idea. And that and I think that at least in the early period, some of the same people that you're talking about would have been part of the diplomatic delegations and part of the teams there at Geneva. And I'm sure probably up until the closure of the League of Nations in the area of the war, so the Kemalist period as well. So I'm wondering if this, I mean, I presume this is part of your dissertation,
Yeah.
right? Okay. So the other wonderful thing about doing research on that period is it's like it's all there at the archive in Geneva, and half of it's online. So you can do a lot of work with that. And it strikes me as it's the conversations that were happening before the war, of course, are going to continue after the war in that context. So Sam, this is just a weird factoid. Jamal Pasha rounds up all those orphans to send to Antura because he thinks they've got cholera.
Is it cholera or typhus?
Cholera typhus. It's a public health emergency. He sends out this order and says you have to everyone has to round up the children because they're all running around and like, right, there's these survivor children. You have to gather them up because they're a public health risk and a public nuisance, and then bring them to the orphanages, right? So it was a way to separate them from any surviving family members. And it always put me in mind of the way not only the seizure of Native American children for the period, but even the use of foster care, where indigenous children would be taken away from their extended family, right? So this was a way for Jamal Pasha to trump even normal family bonds that could exist, and he used a public health measure to do it.
Well, I would be interested to know.
I need to find that.
Because there is a specific typhus epidemic that is spreading with
the kids
with deportees.
Well, this would have been just right.
And it leads to this shift of sending people further out into the desert because it's spreading to the military.
So most of the children who end up going to Antura and the other orphanages in Syria are actually deportees in Homs Hama, right? So they're not desert deportees.
Right, but I'm saying this is coming from all.
Yeah, I think so. It must be.
And so, and there's a way that people see epidemics break out, in Circassian villages out in the desert, and they say this is retribution.
Oh wow,
right?
interesting.
So as an actor's category, it's a meaningful thing.
So it may well be typhus because cholera would have been, but they were urban, so cholera could have been as well. Yeah. So I mean, there's an enormous amount of scholarship on what you're working on already in Ottoman studies, right? But I think one area that's been missed, and I don't think you can get at through a Marxist approach, is that genocide produces a phenomenon of, if you're a survivor, of social death, right? And so what I've always thought has been a problem in our field, except with the exception of Lerna and I, no one has taken up the social death concept to talk about Armenian women in the genocide and post-genocide, right? And this is an absolutely important phenomenon. And it comes from theorizing slavery. the theories of slavery. And so I've written about it in the context of children, is that what was happening at these orphanages was, like kill the Indian, but it was killing the Armenian in them. It was creating a social death of the Armenian child. And what would emerge then would be a preferred Turkish national citizen. And I think with women, you would kill the Armenian in them so that they would become available for reproduction, enslavement, and so on. The other thing I would just encourage you to think about is it goes on this question of what is slavery, right? And I think that the comments made by Gottfried and so on are absolutely correct, is that enslavement, the chattel slavery, right, which is the contract-based slavery, was widely practiced in the Ottoman Empire, and it derives its form even from Roman canon law. It's probably its origin, right, with some Islamic law built into it. And it was banned, but it was a practice. When women were taken, they were taken and they were bought and sold. So it's one of these things where I would encourage you to think more in terms of, if you see something that looks like slavery, just call it slavery, right? So if people are, the article I wrote years and years ago, Satılık çocuk var mı, right? Are there children for sale? Well, you can only buy and sell people who are slaves, right? So I'm just voicing a concern that I think what was a very promising line of research, especially in terms of gender and sexual and gender-based violence during genocide, has just been dropped altogether. So.
Yeah, in the back there, please. It is.
I had a couple of questions. I was wondering about this, the binary that you point out between the colonizer-colonized binary. I guess we could say that I guess this sort of binary just sort of emerges with like the writings of Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi. But in the case of Fanon, at least when he talks about colonizer and colonized, he is referring to the fact that he is talking about a Manichean world vision, and he's problematizing that. He's not actually saying these are the colonizers, these are the colonizers. He's talking about the ways in which people are imprisoned in these categories and the impossibility of stepping outside of that. And but I feel like I guess we kind of post-colonial theory sort of clings to these categories a little bit because it does refer to power relations, and it can be useful, but at the same time, like you said, it does there are cases where post-colonial theory has struggled to fit into any of these categories. And in that regard, on Cevat's comments as well, I was just wondering, like this idea of even separating the Ottoman Empire from the rest of like colonial histories and like calling it imperialism and separating that as from colonialism at a categorically. I feel like Ottoman studies has definitely been has suffered from this, I guess I see colonialism as a form of imperialism, I guess my question is, if we see colonialism as a specific kind of imperialism that emerged in like 15th century with the the covering over of the Americas, and if we see race as one of its primary categories, like a founding principle of it, since we see how the Ottoman Empire has adopted this, and the Turkish state has inherited this, these categories, they can only live in the desert. I think it has some tones of that as well. Where do you see this starting? Do you see this as an adoption or an import, or like something that is being named, like something that's already there being named? I guess that would be my question. And for Shahika, I was wondering, is it? Do you find it, or how do you make sense of the fact that women and women, men, and children were treated in different ways, and this idea of genocide as a gendered violence. What I mean, and also talking about patriarchy as like having emerged along with the capitalist colonial world order. Do you factor that into there in your work, or do you see it relevant?
Repeat your last question.
Yeah, this idea of the fact that like if you're thinking about this, you are thinking about this reproduction, which I find very meaningful and very apt. How do you see the fact that men, women, and children were treated differently during the genocide?
Okay, was there any hands before I turn back to the panel? Okay, so let's start at that end and we'll go back. So.
Okay, I want to start with Gottfried's question on like slavery. So that's so true that one and I should be like careful because like there's US South like plantation slavery system which like in front of like American audience, people tend to think about like US slavery system. But like I think if you are like putting up an auction against your will and like selling like we're being sold like certain amount for a certain amount of money, I mean I could like describe this as a like slavery because these women, enslaved women, let's say, not the entire Armenian woman population, of course, like sold for like 35 mgda or like 7 like pounds, and until they got like rescued from the households. I will prefer to describe they're studied as like slave, but it's of course it's very much different than the US South plantation slavery system, because as far as I understand, and I mostly relied on Matthias Bjornlund's work on that, these like there was no like formal and structural slave market in the Ottoman Empire, like compared to US one. But we could say that there was like an informal slave market where people like aware of it, like similar to, I want to make this analogy, that will be maybe a historical, but like what Yazidi women experienced in like Rojava, they were sold like in northern Rojava and also like in Kurdistan, like cities like Gaziantep, we were aware of that, like they were selling the Yazidi women, like similar to, I think I will prefer to compare these two maybe. And I want to like, you said that Marx mostly focused on like a Roman slavery.
That was my assumption, as just as a preface to hedging against a two binary idea of slavery.
Freedom and freedom. Like, I want to just support my friend Marx, and then he has also like worked very little on US cotton plantation in actually like in the primitive accumulation chapter of Capital Volume 1, and then said that like basically this cotton plantation system generated surplus value, and so it's like part of the capitalist economy. And I unfortunately haven't read yet like your points on like social that, but I will love to read more on. And then I think Ceylan has a question. So I'm very much interested in the question, like both from like a historian perspective, also like as a like woman, why we are like doing and then having, why we carrying this burden doing like reproductive work. This is very essential question from me. And then also like historically, and then throughout history, like Marxist feminist scholars like claim that like colonialism in Latin America, European Spaniards colonialism, and also like witch hunting in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. Like during this time period with the regulations on labor force and also attacking like a woman labor force, women were like expelled from like the wage relations, and then like these reproductive work put on the woman's shoulders. So I think this is one thing like throughout history, capitalism wanna like put this burden because it externalized this. They externalized this reproductive work because it was very expensive for them, and like about the gendered dynamics of genocide. Like as Ron mentioned, I think like every mass violence genocide, like mass atrocities, killings, actually like attacking, especially specifically with different ways to women and children, because like the woman reproduces like the generations, right? Not just like as a biologically. Actually, you're raising your kids, giving like care, emotion, work. So I think that's why this sexual violence and also like the abuse and emotional, you could consider emotional abuse and part of like genocide making too, right? So I think that's why women and then children like in the orphanages so are treated like brutally or badly.
One correction point. I wouldn't say all mass violence is gendered, but I would say genocide is gendered.
Okay.
So, if they aim at killing women and children, if children are the target because the next generation could take revenge, then you're talking, that's a specific thing, because genocide is, in my definition, the killing of a people, not killing people, but the killing of a people, an ethnic, religious group. And then I began to think, of course, what's going on in Gaza when 40% or 50% are children who are being killed. Why is that being targeted? And it's being targeted. They claim it's not being targeted, but it's being targeted. They know what's happening and they know what they're doing. So these are going to be fighters later. This is the next generation of Hamas, and they have to be eliminated. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's the effect. You can comment if you want. I didn't. Okay.
I talk too much, but yes, thank you. I agree that Ottoman studies suffered from just like singling out the Ottoman Empire. I also think political theory suffered from like working through this binary constantly. So I'm just like trying to make them talk to one another. That being said, I absolutely agree that like race is most probably like one of the most important axes of colonization. I don't know if I can pinpoint like how that started in Ottoman history. Of course, there's like, towards the end of it, we've been talking about this entire day. There's extremely racist discourses. I'm not a historian. I'm also not a race and ethnicity scholar. So I don't know. And I'm also, I will think about it, but I don't have honestly a good answer right now. I'm also thinking a little like race is an important axis of colonization, but also race doesn't manifest the same everywhere, even within like the colonial policies of the same country. Like, I'm not even talking about American racism is very different to European racism. Oh, yes, sure. But then say like French colonialism racializes all sorts of non-French people. But then French colonialism in Algeria and French colonialism in the Caribbean look pretty different. So they're like, the French Empire did not have like a blanket understanding of like, oh, we're the metropolitan French people and then everyone else is like the other, and like that is how we treat them. So it is, I think, very contextual, and of course it has like certain patterns, but in a lot of ways it's very specific to like the conditions on the ground. So I am, yeah, so I was thinking a little bit about that as I was listening to you and like this conversation. Like, I think it is difficult to pinpoint like, oh, when this started, kind of on a global level too, because it's just, there are books about, oh, there was always race thinking, but racism became a thing once white supremacy became a thing. But that's also kind of like a very Euro way of looking at it, as if like other places can't be racist. So I don't know. It's a whole can of worms. I'm sorry. Yeah.
How are we doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking for somewhere to do.
Thank you for the proposals. Abdülhamit, before John Turks, there are many memoirs of Abdülhamit, but many of them are fake. But one of them is, I think, true. His special physician wrote it, and it published when Abdülhamit was alive. And he said, my Islam policy is aims to prevent the contamination of the virus of the nationalism to the Muslim people. It's not related to the pan-Islamism like this. This is a very important metaphor, maybe. And I would like to say a few words about Ron's question about the inevitability. If from multi-ethnic empire transition to the ethnic-based national state. According to me, it was not inevitable, and after the revolution, the John Turks ideas was very ambiguous and very different, and they had very many ways in front of them. Why they changed it radicalized in a few years, I think it is related with the Balkan Wars. It is the biggest trauma in the Ottoman history, with the 1877 Ottoman-Russian War, and of course the First World War. I think if they hadn't broke out, the genocide wouldn't have occurred, according to me. A small question to Mehmet. In your proposal, you gave some numbers about the people, Greeks and Armenians. They returned. It seems approximately between 250,000 and 400,000. And of course, we cannot know, but if you have, I am curious if you have an idea, how much of this in absolute numbers or percentage was able to stay and protect their prosperity? Do you have an idea? Thank you.
You want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I think, of course, we don't have data about it, but I'm not actually, no, I don't know about the percentage of this, because after their return and after the, after the removal of French forces and Italian forces or British forces, some Armenians also left from Kilikia and Antep and other areas. So that these numbers also included this population as well. And of course, some Greek populations also went to Greece, Greek population and the Greeks after the population exchange. So I think there are very few of them keep their properties. And we had very ambiguous data how many Armenians were living in the Anatolia back then. I know that they lived in Sivas and other areas, even until 1916 and 1970s. And they kept their properties, of course, but I don't know the percentage of the number.
Well, this was a really interesting time, and we're coming to the end. I just want to say one thing that I think is worth saying, that if you look at these papers and you ask big questions like what's the role of, how does Ottomanism lose out to this, or why these people move ultimately to become genocidal, etc. History helps, and history is about chronology. And I like very much what Murat added. There are a number of events that occur between this 1902 conference and the 1908 revolution, when there is an Ottomanist agenda. That's what they're talking about, that moment. And then the gravitation toward what happens after 1913, right? And one of the things is, and it gets to some of the things that Mehmet has investigated and others have mentioned, is that they can't solve certain problems within their Ottomanist agenda. And the most important thing is, how do you deal with the Kurds and the seizure of Armenian lands and the purported promise to return them? And ultimately, they're going to choose, in a way, a method that Abdulhamid, in a sense, shows, which is maybe we'll either ally with the Kurds, they don't really do that, but we'll forget about that and just go on to something else. And then the war, and then the genocide, and on and on and on. And ultimately, you've got a situation where the nation state becomes the solution to problems. One thing I was very impressed by in reading Shukru Haniolu, there are many problems with that work. We won't talk about that because there are Princeton people here, but I like him very much. And we did invite him to WATS many times, and he promised to come, and then he reneged and didn't come. But it's okay. That's his problem, not mine. But in his book, and in much work that's been done, including Zucker, the empire idea, that we're going to keep an empire, dies late. They're still pushing for empire almost up to what Zucker calls a coup d'etat on November 2nd, 1922. A coup d'etat. That is, a small group decides we're going to make a republic. It's not a unanimous thing. That is, there's still ideas that they're going to save an empire. And the Young Turks never intended to give up the Arab lands. That is, it was still going to be multinational, just more Muslim and more Turkic. And so that's a kind of radical shift. So there's something going on. It's still a tiny bit Ottomanist, but not about the Tanzimat egalitarianism or anything like that. Anyway, I talked too much. It's exactly 4 o'clock, and we have to stop now.